But first of all, we are joined by Nobel Prize-winning economist, currently professor at Columbia University, Joseph Stiglitz. Fantastic to have you here with us. For anyone who didn't catch you on the main stage, what were the key takeaways? How bad are things going to get for us here in Europe?
Well, I emphasized that obviously there's an inflation problem, that the good news is that Europe has finally begun to deal with it, but I argued that they haven't done as much. They should have done it earlier, and that maybe the main message in that area was that Europe is really at war with Russia, but is trying to pretend it's not. It hasn't done what it needs to. No economy goes to war, no country goes to war, pretending that the economy won't be disturbed.
So in terms of what it could have done better, one of the things you talked about was regarding energy back in March, perhaps some kind of agreement, oil and gas. Can things be turned around quickly if there was to be more cooperation at this stage? How much could we mitigate things?
Oh, I think so. I think both the price of electricity could come down from the very high levels, that those who've been very adversely affected, both households and businesses, could be helped by using some taxes, revenues that you get from the windfall profits taxes.
And some countries are looking into that, but it's not a sort of overarching theme everywhere.
That's right. And the point is they're moving in that direction, but for instance, the windfall profits tax is mostly focused on the fossil fuels, not on the traders, not on so many other areas where there are very large windfall profits.
We've got a few more questions coming in about energy. This person says, moving towards renewables, we'll need substantial investments in the grid network, and that requires time. Won't this scarcity of the grid add to inflation?
Well, everything takes time, but you could do a lot more. As Europe has shown, for instance, in some of the investments that they've done in LNG. So you won't have a perfect solution, but you could have a lot better solution than what's happened, where they really haven't had a wartime mentality in making the investments. So they had started last March and realized there's going to be an energy problem. The debate was, should we cut off buying or should we let Russia cut off selling? But it was so clear there was going to be a reduction. And recognizing that, there should have been a wartime response of doing everything that was possible.
Do you think it would have been different if we hadn't have been coming out of a pandemic where economies were still recovering, where there'd been so much focus on health? Or do you think it is more of a sort of long-term thing that people just weren't ready to accept war?
I think it was they didn't want to admit that this was going to be a war. It was inconceivable that there would be another land war in Europe.
Yeah.
We thought that was the history, that was the past you read about, but you don't go through.
Yeah.
So they didn't really want to believe it.
And it's interesting, we were talking here on stage with another speaker earlier about some of the language being used, and even in the media it was a lot of talk about conflict, and then eventually the word war started to be used more as people really got to grips with the severity.
So one thing they could have done, for instance, during the pandemic, as I mentioned in the discussion, we in the United States invoked the Defense Production Act. So even though we weren't at war, but we were at war with the virus. Yeah. We said that the government could order where resources went, what was going to be produced. We could tell a factory, you're going to produce protective gear or something. We recognized that it was a war. And we said, we're not going to rely just on the market. We're going to use the market, but we're not going to rely just on the market. It's so clear to me that that's what they should have done back in March. And they still haven't done that.
We're getting some more questions about cooperation. This one from Joseph says, what countries should the West work more closely with economically in the future? I guess if the distance from Russia continues.
Well, I think that it's clear that the world is becoming more divided. Obviously, Russia is on the other side of the divide. There's some debate about whether, if Putin were to leave, what would that imply? Should there be more of a rapprochement? But the likelihood is that that's going to be a long-term division. And the United States is making a very strong rhetorical break with China. It actually hasn't really broken off, except in areas of technology. But we passed this bill, $250 billion of technology bill that goes so much against European views about state aid and industrial policy, and how Europe was going to respond is not clear. But we're going ahead and saying we have a new Cold War, and we have to begin investing so that we are prepared.
How do you think that affects things if the US is taking such a different approach to Europe?
Well, I think it's very clear it's going to have a very big impact on Europe, because we live in an integrated world. If the United States says we won't allow Huawei or other technology be involved in anything that we engage in, Europe can't buy that product. And that's what it learned in that particular case.
Yeah.
But I think it's going to be broader in most areas of high technology.
Yeah, really interesting to see how those frictions
and one
evolve.
of the things I pointed out in my talk is whether you think the U.S. is right about this or not is really almost irrelevant.
It's such a big player, yeah.
That the reality is this is a bipartisan view, a dominant view that is now really part of you might say, part of the American reality, and therefore Europe is going to have to adapt to this.
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you for all the questions coming in. Turning something completely different, but really interesting. This person wants to know, what are your thoughts on a 4-day work week, and how could that potentially shape our economies of the future?
Well, actually, I think a 4-day work week is not a bad idea. People used to work a 60-hour week, and then it got reduced to 40 hours. Productivity increased a lot. And one has to remember the purpose of an economy is to serve society, not the other way around. And if people want to enjoy more leisure, we should structure our society to allow that. And we're rich enough that we can do that. We don't necessarily need more material goods. What's really scarce is time and what you do with your time. So getting a better...
Would you be on board with universal basic income, something that's been tested here? We've debated it a little bit on stage today.
I'm not in favor of universal basic income right now for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think work is an important part of life. Maybe it's more important in my life than it is in others, and I know younger people often don't feel the same way, but I do think work is part of what gives meaning to life. Secondly, right now, our society actually needs a lot to be done. There's this big challenge of the green transition that I talked a lot about. A lot of people say, can we afford it? My view is we can't afford not to do it. But when we say we can't afford it, what do we mean? We don't have resources. Well, if we have labor and we have capital, we have the resources. So rather than people enjoying leisure, I think they should be devoting their efforts to helping the green transition.
What about education? We've had a few questions coming in about how economics should potentially be taught differently in future, particularly acknowledging that we're living on a finite planet with finite resources.
Well, I think the two major changes in education is first, because of the internet, and so much information is available to everybody, more than was ever available 40 years ago, to anybody, even. The real issue is enabling people to have lifelong learning, to discriminate between good information and disinformation and misinformation. So, in a sense, we have to, our education system really has to function as teaching people the ability to learn and adapt. But the good news at the same time is that we can do a lot of learning outside of the classroom.
Yeah.
And not only, both at work, but over the internet. And online courses are getting better and better at communicating, teaching ideas. So the need for constant learning is clear, and the market, we've responded, and our new technologies have helped both the demand and supply side.
Yeah, and in some ways, that is one of the very small silver linings of the pandemic, that digitalization was so rapid, giving more online learning opportunities and the chance to grow that more quickly. We've talked a bit about the environment. You mentioned that on the main stage and then here. How do you see travel fitting into this? Obviously, business travel, we know the value of conferences like this, but we're also contributing to the problem if we're using fossil fuel-powered transport to get to these kind of events. So where do you sit on that debate?
Well, I think that one needs to focus on the big picture. And the big picture are the big things like fossil fuels being used in energy generation, in transportation, in energy inefficiency, in buildings and housing. So, obviously, we need to be sensitive in travel. I think what Europe has done in strengthening railroads is really an important step in the right direction. And I only wish the United States would do what you're doing in Europe in terms of railroads. But and increasingly there are ways of travel that have a lower carbon footprint. But just think about it. If you go to a meeting and you learn how to be better at conserving energy and being greener, the amount the reduction in the carbon footprint can be many times larger than the carbon footprint of the travel.
Yeah.
So we ought to, one of the things in the meetings is ought to increase our resolve and say, net, did we improve things?
Really interesting. And once again, going back to the value of learning and the value of being in spaces where you can learn new things. Thanks so much. Let's give a huge round of applause to our guest, Joseph Stiglitz. Thank you.